What's that? You want your own theme mocked up in Logic Pro X? I can do that for you. What's up guys, it's Zach Heidi, and today I'm taking a look at the Cue WALL-E from the movie WALL-E while wearing a WALL-E shirt. Now this video is another episode in my monthly film scoring series where I take a look at music from a movie that I love and talk about what makes it so special. What I thought we'd do today is kind of focus on the actual mock-up creation itself. So we're going to be looking at the cue alongside the movie. I've got my own mock-up playing as opposed to the original cue. If you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to leave a like at the end of the video and subscribe for more videos. Okay, so here's the project in Logic Pro X. Now, you'll notice it's pretty sparse. We don't have too much stuff going on. Thomas Newman is really good at taking small ideas and expanding them into full cues, so it wasn't too hard to mock up, actually. Before we get into the details of the cue, I'm just gonna play it through once so you can hear it, and then we'll talk about it. So when I make a mock-up, the very first thing I do is I take the original audio track, which I have displayed here, and I make a tempo map out of it. A tempo map is just a basic guideline so that we're making sure that our mock-up corresponds to anything that's happening on the picture or with regards to the original track itself. So I took this track, I pulled it into Logic, I opened up beat mapping, and you'll notice that in a couple specific spots, I've created little alignment points. Logic will automatically scan and look at the audio file for kind of significant points, loud moments. It'll then use those points as potential frames of reference for synchronization with the tempo. So you'll see here in the beat mapping window, we have all of these detected transients. Now let's say I wanted this little beat here to fall in measure 10. I would just grab measure 10, drag it over, and Logic is gonna do all the work for me and make sure that it corresponds properly. Now, I don't do that for every measure or every beat. I do it where I notice it's starting to fall off from the tempo. So there was quite a few points where it was pretty consistent, actually. A couple ebbs and flows in various spots, but overall we were hovering right around 135 for the whole piece. The next thing I do after I've set my tempo is I create a piano reduction. Now the reason I do this is just to make sure I kind of have the basic melodic ideas. I can focus in on the musical elements as opposed to trying to figure out the very specific orchestrational decisions. I also do this sometimes when I'm composing. Again, it's a nice way to just get your ideas out before you have to worry about the orchestration. Now, I'm not a perfectionist with the piano reduction. I just make sure I got the basic idea. I'm not gonna play the whole thing for you. I'm just gonna kind of A-B this section so you can hear what it sounds like as the piano reduction versus what I wound up finishing. So you get the basic idea. Now sometimes what I'll do is I'll use this as a reference for the score. So I'll quantize everything so it looks good in the score. Then I'll pull up the score editor so you can see that. And I'll have kind of a rough approximation for what to actually copy into the orchestration. I don't always do this. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it takes more work than it's worth. And sometimes I just remember the ideas from having transcribed it in the reduction. So I'll just use that. So once the reduction is done, I start moving to the actual orchestration phase. Now this is where it requires a pretty good ear to be able to hear what's going on, but I always recommend that you start from what you can hear first, and then work your way backwards. Usually it's going to be the melodic elements if it's orchestrated well. Now in this case, the melodic element that I heard was what I assumed to be an English horn, maybe an oboe, but that's pretty low in the oboe register. So I loaded up my staccato patch. This is the Spitfire Studio Woodwinds, the cor anglaise or English horn, and you can hear what that sounds like on its own. Now it goes on and on and on, and we actually have a secondary part that moves through it, but again, it just happened to be all staccatos, so I didn't have to do any crazy tweaking with channels or anything. Now, if this was going to an orchestrator to actually be made into notation, we'd have to separate these parts out, of course, and make it English horn 1, English horn 2. But in this case, it's just for the mock-up. So for my strings, I'm using Cinematic Studio strings for just about everything. I think they're amazing sounding, and I actually have a plugin that I use. It's a free scripter plugin called Thanos that basically compensates for any of the delay that happens naturally inside Cinematic Studio series. So it pulls it back, and I can quantize it appropriately, which is great. So let's hear these pizzicatos. Okay, now again, this is an ensemble patch. If I wanted to be very particular and orchestrate it out, what I would typically do is I would copy the region that I want to move around. I could just copy it like this. I would then use a great shortcut, which is paste at original position. I can then take that and paste it all the way down the sections. And then what I would do is I would go inside each part, determine where the notes actually are for that part. Something like this. It's not quite like that, but just for expedience. And then basically just delete out the notes that I don't want. So we might wind up with something that sounds sort of like this. Now it's a much smaller sound, you'll notice. That's because ensemble patches tend to blend all of the players together. Sometimes that's what you want if you want a bigger sound, but in a lot of cases it sounds less realistic. I didn't spend the time doing that, but that's how I would approach it. Now on this section where we have legatos, I did spend the time because having legatos in an ensemble patch is, number one, it's very difficult to script, which is why most ensemble patches don't do this. Number two, the sound is much too thick because you're getting the doublings of all the string players on one line multiple times over. And number three, it's just hard to orchestrate and separate out for notation. So when it comes to legatos, I usually do orchestrate out through the parts myself. So you'll hear that right here in this section. Now, if I show you my automation here, you'll see it's nothing too crazy, just kind of moving with the ebb and flow. And what I usually will do, just to save myself time with automation, I probably did it here. Yeah, you'll see it's the same automation curve, just kind of tweaked slightly. That's because I copied over each part, including the automation data, and then just adjusted note for note. So that means it's basically a lot easier to edit because you want them to move as an ensemble anyway. So why not have them have the same automation data? All right, let's talk about the percussion, and then we'll go to the non-orchestral instruments. So percussion, pretty straightforward in this piece. We've got shakers, we've got what sounded like a Tibetan bowl of some kind to me, and then we've got harp at the very end, and a couple comedy effects like a doing. I tried my best to approximate it. It wasn't perfect, but it kind of gets the same effect across. Pretty straightforward. Let's move over to the harp so we can hear that. Now the harp I separated out into two channels. I didn't quite like the way that one harp sounded, so I actually doubled it. So one had a brighter sound and one had a darker, more kind of warm body sound. Warm body sound? Yeah, okay, so let's hear one harp on its own and then the other. That's my primary harp, that's Orange Tree. That's Orange Tree's angelic harp. I really like it a lot, but sometimes it is a little lacking in the bright end, so I usually double it with the Logic harp. I like Logic's harp a lot because it's very consistent as a sound. It's not necessarily realistic, but it does capture a very nice kind of plucky sound. So together one more time. Now we are getting a little bit of flamming, meaning there's kind of like a boom between each of them. You could probably compensate from that by having some kind of a delay or turning off a delay. Let's see if that makes a difference. Much better. Yeah, so I highly recommend you check out the delay settings on your track for each. You could, of course, shift and move these MIDI notes around, but it gets tedious and it also makes for a real pain when you're going to notate or export to XML. Okay, lastly, let's talk about some of the non-orchestral instruments. First, we have some of the strums. Now, I noticed in the original track, we had some sort of an ethnic string instrument that was kind of going ding, 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 ding. Maybe a dulcimer, I wasn't quite sure, but I noticed my oud patch sounded a lot like it, so I used that. Now, comedic effect that Newman did was he had it kind of bend downwards. Kind of hard to replicate that realistically, but what I used was basically just a pitch bend, which you'll see right here. So I just bent the pitch down manually and copy-pasted that for ease later, did that in a couple other spots. That's all there is in the beginning of this piece. Later in the piece, we have an electric guitar, actually, that is very subtle, but it's doubling up with the strings. Sounds like this. Actually, a really cool color there. Let's listen to that with the strings. It's almost something that a harp could have accomplished, that kind of like plucky entrance, but he's saving the harp for later, so maybe that's why he put it in a guitar. Then we have kind of ambient bowing things. We also have some like dulcimer plucking, classic Newman stuff. Sounds like this. Basic ambient pad stuff. Then let's go over to the pads, which basically aren't really pads except for this thing I call the whirly pad, something I made from a whirly tube. I use that a lot, and I'm pretty sure Newman does too. It sounds like this. Now that was tricky to figure out how to do, but I think it kind of accomplished the effect in the original track. You can listen and compare it. Now, one thing Newman used quite a bit in this cue were whistles. It was going, I can't even do it anymore. I can't whistle very well, but I did record my whistles and then pitch them up. So this is what they sounded like when they were done. They're actually audio files. The best I could do. They're not great, there's a lot of room tone in it, but in the mix you can't really tell. I'm not a perfectionist when it comes to this sort of thing. If you've seen my YouTube video on perfectionism, hopefully this shows that I sometimes practice what I preach about that. It doesn't have to be perfect, you just gotta focus on your hierarchy of priorities. And in this case, the English horn had to sound great, and the strings had to sound great. Everything else was kind of in the background. And the last thing to talk about very quickly is the sub bass at the end, which sounds sick. If you're not wearing headphones, you better put them on and listen to this because you won't hear it. That's it, it's just a sub bass. I think I used something from Alchemy, but you could use anything with that. You just basically need a sine tone and just pitch it way down. If you're gonna mix this properly, you'd wanna make sure that you actually have some of the high end showing, because on small speakers, you won't be able to hear it. I doubt if you're playing this on like an iPhone, you could even hear this in the first place. You probably just hear click, 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 click. It's a great effect though in the final mix. I'll show you what it sounds like when it's not there. Okay, and here's when it is there. There there you have it. Now, in terms of EQing, you know, I'm not gonna go crazy talking about that, but basically I just try and mimic whatever the track itself is doing. Usually samples are gonna need a little bit of boosting in the highs because when they cut the room tone and just the general noise floor out of these samples when they're recording them, you lose a lot of the high end because hiss kind of exists in the high end. So you kind of have to artificially boost that up a little bit for realism. Not too much, just a little bit. I also added a little bit of compression in these tracks. I have some default compressor settings in my template that I use. Very, very light stuff. Orchestral music, you don't want to go crazy on compression because it squashes the dynamic range, and dynamic range is part of what makes cinematic music kind of feel narrative and have this ebb and flow to it, is that volume. Some other things you can do, I didn't do them on this track, but they kind of help add realism, is find some sort of a stereo spreader. There's something called BX Solo that's a free plugin. I'll link that in the description. And you can also use a tape saturator. I use a free one called IVGI. It kind of gives a warmth to your track, makes it feel like almost like it's tape, but it's very subtle. Now, if you're interested in trying to mock this cue up for yourself, the MIDI is available to all of my patrons on the $5 and up level. So if you're interested in grabbing the MIDI, I hope you'll check it out. Give me a little bit of support. It goes a long way in helping to make these videos. Sheet music for this is also available. I went through the trouble of transcribing it for you all, so if you want to check that out, the link is in the description. I hope you'll tune in next week when I'm announcing the next round of I Listen to Your Music. It's a recurring series on my channel where I listen to all of your musical submissions based on a guideline. So check that out. Hope you enjoyed this mock-up. Let me know if you want to see more like this. Leave a like, subscribe, all that jazz, and Wally, see you in the next video. I'm done.